All right, let's go ahead and get started here. And all right, so we'll go to John as a devotional, the end of the book of John, chapter 21. So, kind of, I think we've talked before, I don't know if it's in this class or a different one, on how Jesus calls Peter son of Jonah in a different section. I think it's probably right around where they were at Caesarea Philippi. And he calls him Peter, son of Jonah. Now, what he means by that is not that this is Peter's dad's name, as much as it is that he's saying that the same way that Jonah turned away from what the Lord was wanting him to do, and then eventually God called him back, he turned back and then went and preached to the Gentiles, right? And so Peter, being one of the main initial people that preached to the Gentiles, it was in many ways a picture like Jonah, that he had turned away. Peter denied the Lord. 3 days later, the Lord rises. Peter's back on board, and he's going to go preach to the Gentiles. Just like Jonah was in the grave 3 days, Peter was 3 days thinking he had denied the Lord before he saw the Lord rise. So anyway, so he calls him Peter, son of Jonah, as a way of capturing the idea of what Jonah was and saying that that's how something will be for Peter's life. So keeping that in mind, I almost wonder if we have something like this again at the end of John. And so haven't heard anybody preach this, but it is kind of an interesting thought. So John 21:15 says, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? So that's kind of an interesting thought. He says, Peter, son of John, do you love me more than these? So I wonder if John is Peter's dad's name either. Or if Jesus is trying to say something here. So he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he repeats it several times. He says, 16, he said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, tend my sheep. He said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And so I think it's kind of interesting because you read right through that and just think, oh, he must be talking about Peter's dad. I think it would have sounded different to Peter if he knows his dad's name's not John and Jesus is calling him Peter, son of John. So, well, that's the question. So here's my thought of what this could be. It's kind of hard to prove this unless we knew for a fact who Peter's dad was. But if his dad is not John, I think what Jesus is saying, and I think it fits the context very well, of what Jesus is saying is that when Peter and Jesus first met, what were they doing? Peter was, when they first met, he was a disciple of John. And John tells everyone, because Peter had been following John and they were expecting the Messiah. And when they find out that John is saying that Jesus is the Messiah, then all of a sudden John's disciples, particularly these few here, like Simon and Andrew and the sons of Zebedee, were disciples of John first, and then they left everything there to then come follow Jesus. And I almost wonder if Jesus is saying, I thought you were my disciple, but you turned your back on me. You understand? Because the event here is, you were supposed to be following me, and you denied me and left. And so it's almost as if Jesus is saying, are you really my disciple or not? Because, I know you were his disciple, right? But you were supposed to now be my disciple, not his anymore, but you didn't follow me. And so it's almost like he's saying, if somebody comes to work for you and they used to work at some other company, say if you come to work at Coke and you used to work at Pepsi, and then all of a sudden you destroyed one of the machines, and your boss comes in and says, well, Mr. Pepsi employee, do you want to work here or not? What is he saying? He's saying, I thought you gave that up because you wanted to be here, but then you're proving that you don't really want to be here. So are you my disciple, or are you still where you were? Did you really come follow me with everything or not?
So you think it's John the Baptist?
I think it's John the Baptist. Peter was a disciple of John the Baptist. Because this is just, Jesus was only with them 3 years. So most of Peter's life was spent as a disciple of John. Right? It's just here these last couple of years that he said, I don't want to be a disciple of John. I want to give everything to follow Jesus. And then when the moment of truth comes, when it was actually going to finally cost him something, he left and didn't actually follow Jesus, even though he was the one that kept saying that he would. And so when Jesus is testing his loyalty here at the end of John, he calls him Simon, son of John. Right? So it could be that that's what he's getting at there, is that, hey, I thought you were following me, but are you still his disciple, or do you love me? Right? And he asked him 3 different times, and he says, well, if you are my disciple, feed my sheep. Right?
Why didn't they just say Johnson?
Johnson. Well, let me see here. I think I'll save that one for the associates class. And just kidding.
Well, I wonder if that's how they, maybe Johnson was probably because he was the son of John.
I know what you mean.
I wonder how they, because there's Jameson, there's,
Right.
all kinds of last names like that.
I'm sure it is. I would assume that's probably where that came from. So this is kind of interesting thought. I don't know how far you could take it or preach it, but it is interesting because Jesus does this same thing with the Jonah thing, which is why I think it's kind of neat, because you see Jesus doing this once already before Peter denies him. He kind of does this same kind of thing, and so. And this is very common in that world. Jesus is son of David, right? Son of man. Right? So this was a common expression back then to convey a general category, a type, if you will, of someone. And so I think Jesus is intentionally calling him disciple of John here, because his discipleship with Jesus has now come into question because he betrayed the Lord, right? And so I think he's intentionally drawing this out.
Is this mostly New Testament?
You're saying, do you see this in?
New Testament mostly.
Yeah, I think it's a Hebrew thing. So I think you could, you probably. I can't think particularly of too many instances of that in the Old Testament, but I would think that was kind of maybe it's something that just came around in the New Testament. It's possible, but that idea of one person embodying something and then other people embodying it is kind of a Hebrew thing. Just like Jesus is the second Adam, he's not really Adam. But there's an idea there that he is kind of like that. Maybe even the fact that we are made in God's image. That we're not really fully like the Lord, but we kind of carry some of those characteristics. But it's probably definitely more of a Hebrew mindset than it is the Hellenistic, Greek mindset. So whether these Hebrews were thinking this way in the Old Testament, I can't off the top of my head think of any examples of that, although that doesn't mean that there's not. All right, a couple other things that we'll get to here just real quick. So I have one big lesson. Let me do this small one first, just as maybe like a second devotional. So if this is the promised land, then we know that kind of over here, way over in Iraq, was the most likely spot for biblical Ur, and then probably did not come through the desert. Came up this way. Haran is up here, right? And then coming through here, Laish is here. This is where Dan, the tribe of Dan, went and wiped these people out. This is where Abraham passed through when he came into the promised land. In fact, they have the gate still in Laish. It's at a dig site called Tel Dan, because it became Dan and not Laish. But that gate is still there today. They think it's the same gate that Abraham would have passed through. So kind of just the thought is, I was thinking about how the Israelites had fallen into idolatry in Egypt. God brought them out. There was a middle stopping point in the wilderness before they entered into the promised land. And I almost wonder if that's not foreshadowed in the life of Abraham a little bit. That here he is in Babylon, where clearly they were falling into idolatry. Even his own family was idolatrous, right? His own father, Terah, had fallen into idolatry as well. And so the Lord draws him out of this. Not all that different than the Lord drawing the Israelites out of Egypt. Then they have kind of a stopping point here where those who didn't really trust the Lord, they stayed until those people died out, right? And they stayed right there in the middle until the idolatrous ones, Terah, died out, the older generation. Then the younger generation of Abraham who trusted the Lord, then were able to come down into the promised land. So I think it's kind of a very similar picture what God is doing here with Abraham in a major enemy, evil city. God sees Abraham's heart, calls him to leave, so they leave everything, but not everyone that goes really trusts in the Lord. So there's a stopping point in the middle where everything falls away that doesn't really trust in the Lord, so that those who do trust in the Lord can enter in to the promised land. And it's a very similar story to the Exodus. Haran being like the wilderness, Babylon being like Egypt, and then the entrance into the promised land. So it's just kind of an interesting thing that if God used that process for Abraham and then used that same process for the Israelites, it tells you that that is probably a theme, right, which ultimately is going to have something to do with salvation, But anytime God does the same kind of big storyline in the same way, it tells you that he's trying to teach something through this process. It didn't just happen to coincidentally happen that way. And so I think then the third version of it would probably be Jesus and how everyone has fallen into sin. And so Jesus made a way for everyone to leave, but not everyone who he made a way to leave is going to actually make it into the promise, because many of them are not actually going to trust in the Lord. So Jesus has made a way so that everyone can escape sin. But many of them will never make it into the promised land because they never really trusted God to begin with. So, kind of an interesting thought.
To a certain point, I think Jacob, he left home, right? And then went to
Laban's house. So he comes over to Laban.
So he wasn't a slave. He wasn't necessarily
Right.
treated rightly.
Well, in a way, in terms of biblical slave, in many ways he was. That he had.
Kind of like a boss.
Yeah.
Working.
He had given a contract for 14 years that he had to fulfill, and he couldn't leave until he fulfilled those 14 years. And even then, that's a good example, because when he finally did leave from Laban and his little mini army followed after them. Very similar to Pharaoh's army. Yeah. Be interesting to know if there was a story we just didn't hear about of because we don't know anything. It just says he went from here to here. We don't know anything about how they went. It'd be interesting to know if the other ones people came after him. Egypt, Laban. Makes you wonder if there's a story that just didn't get included. It could be, but it's kind of an interesting thought. But yeah, so I think the Laban story is very similar.
I wish I
And
would have known this story, because I could have thought, we're doing things.
oh, things, yeah. So yeah, so that's a one with Laban. That's a good one. And I think the speaking of Jesus is one. They are then dispersed globally in what Egypt and Babylon represented. Now the Jews are dispersed globally in that, and at the time of Jesus, he draws them out from all kinds of worldly cities. The day of Pentecost, they had come from everywhere, from out of their dispersion back to the Promised Land. So I think there's probably a picture of that in there too.